You just got done saying how Zoom meetings start on time.
Right.
I think there's some water on the stove.
Okay, welcome everybody to our pre-Shavuos class, Judaism 201 class. If you read the the invitation, you know how this starts. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll delve into the questions. So, the first question, the most obvious: what makes Shavuos different from all the other holidays? Why is this holiday different from all the other holidays? And actually, it's not just that it's different. It's that there are a couple of kind of strange things about it. I think the strangest thing is that it's the only holiday that's listed that doesn't have a date. And we know, the 15th of Nisan is Pesach, and, the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, and this and that. And the Torah never lists a date. We know when it is because the Torah does say that we should celebrate on the 50th day of the Omer, but that's a little bit odd, and we'll come back to that. It's the only one of the festivals that we don't celebrate for a week. Pesach is a week, and Hashem specifically tells us on the 7th day of Pesach there should be a Yontif, and Hashem more or less directly says that about Sukkot also. It talks about how the 8th day should be a separate holiday, the Shemini Atzeres. And of course, what's ironic is that although it's the only festival that doesn't last for a week, the name Shavuos means weeks. So kind of cute. We know that the name of a holiday gives a lot of meaning to it. It's not just, the names aren't just flippant. So Pesach, for example, which really is only one element of one of the plagues that, Hashem, or that, passed over the houses of the Yidden, we know is actually has a larger meaning, that it's, that we should transcend our limitations. We should pass over our Mitzrayims. And it's the same with the names of the other holidays. So Shavuos, what's the deal with calling the holiday weeks? I also mentioned in the blurb that there's no specific mitzvahs for, we don't have a matzah or a sukkah or a shofar or a menorah. Granted, we have some strong minhagim that some people almost raise to the level of a mitzvah, cheesecake or ice cream, right, or all night learning. But those are just minhagim. The only mitzvahs we have are either minhagim, if you want to call them mitzvahs, or the generic yontif mitzvahs, lighting candles, making kiddush. And you might think that the most significant event in human history might warrant a mitzvah or two to commemorate it. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's the most significant event in human history, not just in Jewish history. Even if you're skeptical of a lot of things, you can say that the birth of the whole idea that God is one and monotheism started with Sinai. We got it first. The other two main religions borrow from our Torah, which we got first.
So hearing the Torah reading is not a mitzvah?
That's also a minhag, right? It's also a minhag. It's certainly not a Torah mitzvah. Right. The Gemara in Pesachim says something really interesting. It points out that regarding Pesach, it says, regarding Pesach, it says there shall be an Atzeres, or an assembly for you. And on Sukkot, there's a similar passage in the Torah that says it should be an assembly for Hashem. So there's a debate in the Gemara. What exactly does that mean? So Rabbi Eliezer says, well, you have two options. You either have to have the holiday be an assembly for Hashem, or you have to have a holiday that's an assembly for you. And and how they interpret that is that you either need to you have two options. You can either devote the day to eating and rejoicing, or you can devote the day to sitting and learning. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, it means those are the two things that you have to do on a yontif. You have to spend part of the day rejoicing and eating. You have to spend part of the day learning. But those are just those two holidays, Pesach and Shavuos. After that discussion, he says, but everybody agrees that on Shavuos, you have to spend the whole day. You would think it would say learning, right? But it's the opposite. You have to spend the whole day indulging yourself. You have to spend the whole day rejoicing and eating. So I'm going to throw that out as toss that out as another question. Why that? And let me ask one more question before we get into some discussion and answers. And that is, Judaism has our holy places. There's a Gemara which lists, the 10 stages of holiness. You have Eretz Yisrael is one level, and Yerushalayim is another level, and then as you approach the Beis Hamikdash, it gets holier and holier until you get to the inner sanctum, the Kadosh HaKadoshim in the Beis Hamikdash. And we also, you might even say, we have other holy places in our religion. We have the Marsa Mechpelah, where the Avos are buried. Avos and Imahos are buried. Some people say that Tzfat has a level of Kedusha in it. But the holiest place in the world, the birthplace of our religion, is just some nondescript mountain in the desert that we don't even know where it is. The moment we left Har Sinai, poof, it wasn't holy anymore. So let's now try to address all those questions. But before we do, I want to discuss a little bit more about the date of Shavuos, because in the Gemara, we find something really, really surprising. So there's a machlokes, there's a disagreement, a debate in the Gemara as to when Shavuos is. So first you might ask, how can there be a debate, right? 50 days later is Shavuos, so you just look on the calendar. But we have to remember that back then, it was not a fixed calendar, so we don't know if that year the month of Nisan had 29 or 30 days, or if Iyar had 29 or 30 days. So it comes out that Shavuos possibly could have been on the 5th or 6th or 7th of Sivan. For whatever reason, so the Gemara goes through calculations. It knocks off the 5th of Nisan, 5th of Sivan as a consideration. So the debate is whether it happened on the 6th or on the 7th. So the Gemara goes through the logic. The Gemara from other sources, we figure out that we got to Har Sinai on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. Okay, so we know on the 1st of Sivan is when we arrived. And it goes through the events that are mentioned in the Torah. This happened on the next day, and this happened on the next day. But there's one part where they begin to have a dispute, and that is that Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is going to be a big thing for the rest of our discussion. Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu that you should separate from your spouses for 3 days, so you have you're at the highest level of holiness when the Torah is given. And Moshe figures out, using some Gemara logic, as the rabbis do all throughout the Gemara, Moshe figures out, if Hashem said 3 days, it needs to be 3 full days. So I'm going to start counting tomorrow. And the Gemara makes a big deal of the fact that Moshe added a day, and that Hashem approved of Moshe adding a day. So the question is adding a day, does that make it the 6th or the 7th of Sivan? And that's what the debate's about. So the debate seems to be equal if you follow the debate. And anybody who has an R-Scroll Gemara, I urge you to look at page 88 in the Gemara Shabbos, where this whole thing is discussed. The whole thing of Matan Torah and holding the mountain over the people and all that stuff is all on page 87 and 88. It's fun reading. It's good reading. So is it the 6th or the 7th? So you can sort of go either way, but Rebbe Yossi pulls out a trump card. He says, look, from other sources of Chazal, we know that we left Egypt on a Thursday. I don't know how he knows that, but there's no debate. We left Israel, we left Mitzrayim on a Thursday. So that means Thursday night was the first day of the Omer. And we also know that Shavuot, that the Torah was given on a Shabbos. So 7 weeks later, 7 times 7, you figure that out. So Thursday would have to have been the 50th day of the Omer. So Friday night would be the 51st day of the Omer, and Saturday, Shabbos, would be the 52nd day of the Omer. And so he says, well, the 52nd day of the Omer is the 7th of Nisan. And so he holds it was the 7th of Nisan. Now, on one hand, it doesn't make any difference to us because we count 50 days, and 50 days is the 6th of Sivan. And so that's fine. But still we have to ask, what, and it turns out if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avraham says, you know what, Rebbe Yossi was right. It really happened on the 7th of Nisan. So the most important day in our religion, and we don't even know what date it was, and if you had to pick a date, maybe it's the 7th of Sivan. We're not even celebrating on the right date. So what is all that about? So so there's our question. So let's try and answer some of them. I think the simplest answer that ends up answering a lot of this is a really nice one. It's a very simple thought from the Kli Yakar. And he says that why do we have no date? It's a message to us that's saying to the effect that every day should be a day that we are receiving Torah. I think an analogy could be, I've heard in many families express the idea that every day is Mother's Day, right? Mothers do so much. Every day is Mother's Day. We should be celebrating the awesomeness of mothers every day. And the idea is that confining Matan Torah to one day limits it, and on some level limits it from the other days. So perhaps we can develop that idea a little bit further. Why is it the only festival that's not a week long? And we get the same idea. The other festivals celebrate actual events. Pesach celebrates leaving Mitzrayim. Sukkot celebrates the protection that Hashem gave us in the desert. But for receiving the Torah, yes, it was an event, but we don't want to celebrate it as an event. We want to celebrate it as a process. We want to celebrate it as a paradigm for what the whole rest of the year ought to be. We're going out of our way to say we're not celebrating the event. We're celebrating the process of receiving Torah. And perhaps that's why it's called Shavuos also. It's called weeks. We don't call the holiday Matan Torah. That is an expression which I'll get to, Zaman Matan Torah Seinu. But the actual holiday is called Shavuos, the most direct way we call it, which means weeks. And perhaps that's to tell us that the weeks preceding the giving of the Torah are just as important as the day we actually receive the Torah. And we can apply the same idea to answer the question of why there are no mitzvos, right? We don't want to elevate some mitzvahs over the others when we're talking about receiving the Torah. Everything was given at Har Sinai, including the blueprint to figure out further mitzvahs. So at this point, you might ask, yeah, but at Har Sinai, we talk about the Aseres Adibros. We talk about 10 commandments. So why 10? So that's a whole other discussion, but I'll quickly answer it just by mentioning two ideas. So one is that it is said that all 613 mitzvahs are derivable from the 10. I don't know how, but that's a given idea. And the second idea is a more mystical idea that there's a connection between the 10 Commandments, and as Pirkei Avos said, that with 10 utterances, Hashem created the world. So there's an idea that the energy that Hashem put into the world then got reflected through the 10 Commandments, and that's a whole Kabbalistic thing. But the point remains that Shavuos does not have any specific mitzvahs associated with it. So that leaves us with two questions still. One is, what about that discussion from Pesachim that says that we should celebrate it all for ourselves? And I think the answer actually, from a Kabbalistic point of view, is a pretty simple one. We want to bring Torah down into this world to make it a dwelling place for Hashem. So we do that by engaging in this world, whereas mitzvahs connect us maybe to Olam Haba. I think there's a wonderful example of this, I think, in Gemara Tosfos. In the Gemara, towards the beginning of Brachos, it's either on page 11 or 14, Tosfos asks a really great question. I love this question. He says, look, when you go into a sukkah and you do something, particularly when you eat, you have to make a bracha, right? Asher Kiddushan Masav Sivan Leishev B'Sukkah. You know, I acknowledge I'm dwelling in the sukkah. And if you go out of the sukkah to do something, I don't know, take a shower, then you come back in and you want to take another snack, you need to make the bracha again. Asher Kiddushan Masav Leishev B'Sukkah. He says, fine. There's an obvious reason for that. There's a concept in halacha called hesech hadas, which means that you have removed your mind from the situation, from the mitzvah that you're doing. So when you were in the sukkah, you were thinking about the sukkah. Fine. So as long as you stay in the sukkah, you don't have to make the bracha again. When you come in to take a shower, you're not thinking about the sukkah anymore. Then when you go back into the sukkah, you're thinking about it again. You need to make the bracha again. Okay, that's fine. But then he asks the question, he goes, what about the blessing we make for studying Torah? We say that first thing in the morning. We say, if we do our morning brachas, we say, you know, Asher Kisham Sok B'divrei Torah. And then we also say the prayer, Asher Bachar Bana Mikol Ami. Right? We say brachas relating to Torah. And even if we don't do that, the brachas right before Shema can in a b'diavad situation, can substitute for the Birchas HaTorah. So we ask the question, fine, so you make your bracha, and because we don't want to have hesech hadas, if you do your morning brachas right away, you recite a passage from the Torah that relates to learning, great, everything's fine. And then you go have breakfast, and then you go take a walk, or you go to the gym, right? And then you Zoom up somebody and you have a conversation. And then you decide to open a sefer and study Torah. He says, why don't you make a bracha again, just like you did with sukkah? And his answer, I love this answer. He says, Torah applies every minute that you're awake. You're always thinking about Torah. Now, granted, Tosfos is on a higher level than us. Maybe there's a level to which we should aspire. So Torah applies all the time, right? So when we have the snack, we're making brachas before we eat. We're thinking about kashrus. When's the last, if we're having, eggs and cheese, when's the last time I had meat? You got to think about that. Or if we want to have meat, what are my plans for lunch? When we go for a walk, if we see a fruit tree in the spring, maybe there's a bracha to make. If we see a rainbow, there's a bracha to make there. Even when we go to the bathroom, right? When we come out of the bathroom, we say Asher Yatzar. And even when we're in the bathroom, even though we're not supposed to be thinking about Torah when we're in the bathroom, all right, if we're going into the bathroom on Shabbos, we want to see that there's a box of tissues there, so because we don't want to rip toilet paper. The point is that Torah applies, since Torah can apply pretty much every minute. That's Tosfos' reason why when we say a Birchas HaTorah, a blessing on learning Torah first thing in the morning, it works for the whole day. So so that's part of the reason why we'll say that we don't want to restrict Torah to just a couple of mitzvahs, because it applies to everything. And that's an idea of bringing Torah down. And here's even a stronger idea of bringing Torah down. Most of us probably know the story of the oven of Achnai. If you want to look it up, Bava Metzia 59. It's the story where Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis are debating a particular aspect of halacha relating to Tuma and Tahara, and about a particular oven. And Rabbi Eliezer is starting to get really angry because he thinks his logic is right. And I'm sure most of you know the story. He says things like, if I'm right, the river should turn this way, and the river starts flowing the opposite way. And the other rabbis say, well, we're outvoting you. We disagree with you. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, the walls should fall down, and the walls start getting shaky. And every time the rabbi is saying, well, we don't like your logic. We don't want to vote that way. So finally, Rabbi Eliezer pulls out his trump card and says, if I'm right, a bas kol should come out, a voice from Hashem should come out and say that I'm right. And unbelievably, a bas kol comes out from heaven, and essentially Hashem is saying, everything that Rabbi Eliezer said is correct. And what do the rabbis do? For those of us who know the story, the rabbis say, Lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven anymore. You gave us the Torah, and we're deciding a different day. What's a little bit less well known is the Gemara goes on to explain how Hashem reacted afterwards. And some of you may know this. Hashem apparently laughed, and he was happy. He rejoiced in the fact, saying, my children have defeated me. He was happy. What's that about? What's that about? And maybe the answer is also related to the answer. There's also a story. This is back on Shabbos 88. The Gemara tells a story that Moshe comes up to get the Torah, and the angels are saying, what are you giving it to him for? Give it to us. We're more pure than he is. And Hashem says, okay, Moshe, defend yourself. And Moshe says, look, one of the 10 commandments says, honor your father and your mother, and angels, you guys don't have mothers and fathers, right? And it says, don't murder, and angels, you guys aren't involved with murder, so we're the ones that need it. So that question, that story used to bother me, because I think any school kid could have come up with those arguments, and couldn't the angels themselves have thought of those arguments? I mean, that seems really simplistic. But I think the deeper answer to that is that the angels knew that we were going to take the Torah and we were going to work in a joint partnership with Hashem in order to develop Torah, in order to develop halacha. And that's what the prior story we just said about the oven of Achnai also tells us. Hashem was happy that we took this body of halacha, and even though Hashem would have ruled one way, we used rigorous logic and we ruled the other way, and Hashem was good with that. Not only was he good with that, but he was happy with that. We are taking the abstractness, the purity of Torah, and adopting it to the reality of here on earth. And the angels can't do that because they don't live here on earth. And perhaps that's really what the angels were either angry about or they couldn't understand. Right? The traditional idea of an angel is that they're a messenger from Hashem and they can only do what Hashem tells us. And here you have Moshe Rabbeinu saying, you know what, Hashem, you might have planned to give the Torah on the 7th of Sivan, but I'm thinking since you said 3 whole days, it ought to be on the 7th of Sivan. And that's something that an angel would never think of, would never do. It's like, give me your orders, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And here we are on earth saying, Lo bashamayim, the Torah's not in heaven anymore. We're going to make our own rules. We're going to adopt the Torah to the way we need it here. So I think if you think about it, then the 6th of Sivan, on the contrary, seems to be, if you hold that the Torah was given on the 7th of Sivan, and it seems like we paskin that way, then the 6th of Sivan, in a way, is like the perfect day to celebrate Zaman Matan Torasena. So that's the phrase we use in our davening. That's another phrase we use to describe Shavuos, Zaman Matan Torasena, which means the time of the giving of our Torah. So notice it doesn't say Hayom, it doesn't say the day that we got Torah. And also notice that it doesn't say it's the time we got Hashem's Torah, it's the time we got our Torah. Hashem may have given it, but it is ours now. Some even go further to point out that, if you hold by the seventh, if you hold that it happened on the seventh, which the seventh happens to be Yom Tov Sheni, the second day of Shavuos, only for those outside of Israel, right? The Torah was given outside of Israel. So some point out, this is a great observation, I think, that Hashem was celebrating Yom Tov Sheni with us. He was celebrating the second day of Shavuos with us by giving it to us outside of Israel on what we would eventually, the rabbis would eventually create a Yom Tov Sheni for those who are the second day of the holidays for those who live outside. The whole thing really bespeaks of the following, that we are making a partnership with Hashem. There's Torah plus us, and together as a partnership we build on Torah. There's another story also on page 88 in Shabbos. It says a certain Galilean said to Rav Chisda, the Torah was given in threes, which some say Tanakh is the three parts of the Torah, Tanakh, and Kesuvim, to a people of thirds, Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisrael. To the third born, Moshe was third born, and on the third day of the separation that we were just talking about, on the third month, if the Torah counts the months from Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. So what's this whole idea of threes? And the idea of threes applied here is that you have Hashem creating the Torah, us as a people receiving the Torah, and you get truth by taking two different ideas and putting them together, and it's this partnership which is represented by the number three. And so finally, that sort of answers our question as to why Har Sinai is now some nondescript mountain in the desert where nobody knows where it is. And the idea is this, that when holiness is created by God, when holiness is created by Hashem, it only lasts for a moment. A holiness created by a partnership with us and Hashem can last forever. That's one of the lessons of the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, right? The standard first number one question you ask with the sin of the golden calf is, how can a people who just got the Torah then go off and sin like that? And the idea is that when we first got the Ten Commandments, Hashem did all the work. Hashem carved out the luchos, the tablets, and Hashem did the writing, and Hashem told Moshe, and that was it. So we didn't value it as much. These tricks of Har Sinai or splitting of the Red Sea, they make an awesome impression, but the impression just fades away. But when we work for it, that's a whole nother level. And it's extremely significant that what happens after Moshe smashes the tablets. By the way, I should mention that it says, the Gemara says, what are three things that Moshe Rabbeinu did that didn't seem necessarily first appropriate, but that Hashem approved of later? And I forgot what the third one is, but the first one was that Hashem added an extra day, which we've been talking about. The second one was that he broke the luchos. Hashem didn't tell him to do that. He just did that all on his own. He broke the luchos. So why was that such a great thing that he did that? Because Hashem said, okay, Moshe, you carve out the second set of tablets and then come back up here and we'll talk about this Torah thing again. The idea is that this time we are putting our effort into receiving the Torah. And that's why the second set of luchos, in effect, at least in a symbolic way, lasted forever. So in order to sum up, I see we're about a half hour already. Our entire existence is a partnership with Hashem. This is a really important message. Each of us individually, we play a role in the future of the Jewish people, the future of society, by whether we choose to bring the light of Hashem down into the world, by doing mitzvahs, by learning Torah, by involving ourselves in the world, and elevating what would otherwise be simply mundane acts. So you may ask, a legitimate question is, how in the world can we partner with Hashem regarding mitzvahs and Torahs if we don't even know enough to seriously engage? You know, we think of Torah study, we think of, you know, the rabbis late at night with their Gemaras open and reading all these texts. I mean, we're not at that level. So the two obvious answers to that is, one, any level of engagement is good. We're each on our own level. And two, any stagnation is not good. You know, there's a mashal, a lesson derived from the fact that the ramp on the Mizbeach did not have steps. It was just a slanted ramp. And the answer is that's a model for the world, for how we should act and how we should ascend. That when you're on a ramp, if you stand still, you're going to fall backward. You always need to be leaning forward. You always need to be progressing forward. And so too for us. So we should get involved. The quarantine has enabled us to have some extra time. We should read more. We should take classes. And I realize I'm preaching to the choir because you're all taking a half hour out of the middle of the day to listen to me. So Yasher Koach to all of you for showing up. So, you know, just as Pesach is considered a propitious time to think about transcending our limitations, you know, Pesach is skipping over our mitzrayim, our limitations, and it's a propitious time to daven for help in transcending our limitations. So too, Shavuos is a propitious time to renew our efforts in engaging with Torah and to daven for help in engaging with Torah. And engaging in Torah obviously means both, you know, learning about it and doing mitzvahs. So, in summary, in the summary of my summary, there's no single date, there's no single mitzvah that can represent Torah because everything is Torah. And we just need to learn to recognize that message and to put it into practice and to learn, you know, as they say in Pirkei Avos, you know, delve into it because everything is in it. So my bracha to all of you, to all of us, is let our quarantine Shavuos, where maybe the quarantine is giving us some extra time, to give us the strength to renew ourselves and to engage with Torah, and for all of us to reach new levels of Torah understanding and practice in the upcoming year. Chag Sameach, everybody.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.